The Midnight Deception, June 5th, 1944. 23:47 hours, 600 feet above Yvetot, France. The Halifax bomber shuddered as Squadron Leader John Poole gripped the static line, his gloved hand white-knuckled against the cold aluminum. Behind him, 12 men from 3 squadrons, Special Air Service, crouched in the dim red light of the cargo bay. But they weren't the mission's primary payload. That honor belonged to the silent passengers stacked against the fuselage wall. 500 crude fabric dolls, stuffed with straw and sand, each one a calculated lie wrapped in parachute silk. 2 minutes, the dispatcher shouted over the roar of 4 Merlin engines. Poole's second-in-command, Lieutenant Davies, adjusted the Sten gun across his chest and glanced at the bizarre cargo. In 12 years of military service, he'd never imagined his survival would depend on scarecrows. Each dummy wore a miniature parachute and carried a device the boffins called a pintail, a firecracker mechanism designed to simulate rifle fire for 90 minutes after landing. Some also contained amplifiers broadcasting recordings of battle sounds, small arms fire, and shouted orders in English. The aircraft banked sharply, throwing men against the fuselage. Poole had flown 32 combat missions over occupied Europe, but tonight felt different. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was unfolding in darkness below. 13,000 real paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne would soon drop on the flanks of Utah and Omaha beaches. British 6th Airborne Division would seize vital bridges near Caen. Success depended on surprise, on overwhelming force hitting precisely coordinated objectives, and on 12 men with straw dummies making the Germans look the wrong direction. 30 seconds. Poole felt his stomach tighten. The planning for this operation had been meticulous, almost obsessive. British intelligence officers had spent months studying German defensive psychology, analyzing how Wehrmacht commanders responded to airborne threats. The conclusion was elegant and brutal. German doctrine mandated immediate, overwhelming response to paratrooper incursions. They would commit reserves, mobilize armor, create defensive perimeters. The trick was making them do all that 15 miles from where it mattered. The green light flashed. Go, go, go! Bodies and bundles tumbled into the screaming darkness. Poole felt the familiar gut punch of freefall before his chute snapped open, jerking him violently upward. Around him the night sky bloomed with canopies, some carrying men, most carrying deception. Below, the Norman countryside stretched dark and unknowing, dotted with occasional farmhouse lights that would soon become German machine gun positions. The wind tore at Poole's face as he descended. He could see other chutes drifting in the moonlight, some spiraling lazily, others dropping fast. The dummies had no way to steer, no ability to avoid power lines or trees. That was part of the design. Real paratroopers often got tangled or injured landing in unfamiliar terrain. The dummies would create authentic-looking casualties, complete with abandoned equipment and parachute silk flagging positions. Poole's boots hit wet earth with a bone-jarring impact. He rolled, came up with Sten gun ready, and quickly stripped his parachute harness. The training was automatic, ingrained by hundreds of practice jumps. Around him in the darkness he heard soft whistles, his team signaling positions. They'd all made it down alive. Phase 1 complete. Now came the hard part, convincing an entire German division they were facing an army. Scarecrows in the moonlight Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in the command post of the 711th Infantry Division near Yvetot, studying topographical maps when the telephone erupted. Herr Hauptmann, paratroopers, hundreds of them. Weber grabbed his coat and Luger, bursting through the door into chaos. Distant gunfire crackled across the valley, sporadic, disorganized, but unmistakably present. Flares arced into the sky, illuminating dozens of parachutes drifting earthward. His pulse quickened. This was the invasion everyone had whispered about for months. Alert all units! Fallschirmjäger! American paratroopers landing en masse! Mobilize reserves immediately. Weber had been stationed in France for 18 months, enduring the slow erosion of certainty that defined occupation duty. Every morning brought new intelligence reports about potential invasion sites. Every evening brought the same question: when? His men were exhausted from constant readiness drills, from manning beach fortifications, from wondering if tonight would be the night. Now, apparently, it was. Within minutes, 2 companies of infantry, nearly 300 men, were rushing toward the sounds of combat. Motorcycle dispatch riders roared through village streets, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog. Wehrmacht trucks rumbled to life, engines coughing diesel smoke as soldiers clambered aboard, clutching Mauser rifles and MG-42 machine guns. Private Klaus Richter was among the first to reach a landing site. His boots squelched through wet grass as he approached a figure tangled in parachute lines beneath a hedgerow. "Hände hoch!" he shouted, rifle raised. The figure didn't move. Richter edged closer, finger tense on the trigger. He grabbed the parachute silk and yanked. The paratrooper flopped forward, lifeless, straw spilled from a torn seam. Was zum Teufel? What the hell? But there was no time to process the absurdity. Gunfire continued popping in the distance, steady, persistent, the rhythm of sustained combat. Orders crackled over field radios. More parachutes were reported 3 kilometers north. The dummy in Richter's hands could be a decoy. The real attack might be anywhere. Richter's squad leader, Feldwebel Otto Kranz, arrived moments later, breathing hard from running. He stared at the dummy, then at Richter. "Is this a joke?" "I don't know, Herr Feldwebel. But listen." Richter pointed toward the tree line, where automatic weapons fire echoed through the darkness. "That's real. Machine guns, at least 2 positions." Krantz nodded slowly. "American diversionary tactic. They drop dummies to confuse us, draw us away from the real landing zones." He keyed his radio. "Command, this is Fox 7. We have confirmed dummy paratroopers in Sector Charlie 9, but we also have contact with actual enemy forces approximately 800 meters northwest. Request orders." Weber's voice crackled back. "Proceed with caution. Investigate all landing sites. Real paratroopers will consolidate positions and attempt to seize key infrastructure. All units maintain high alert." The German response machine kicked into full gear. Every available unit in the 7th Division's area of operations received mobilization orders. Company commanders roused sleeping men, distributed ammunition, organized search patterns. The division's reconnaissance battalion deployed motorcycle troops to scout reported drop zones. Artillery batteries calculated firing solutions for suspected American assembly areas. Weber's command post descended into controlled pandemonium. Reports flooded in from multiple sectors. Paratroopers near Doudeville, contact at Fauville, movement detected toward Lillebonne. The map became a spider's web of red marks. Each report seemed to confirm a massive airborne assault targeting the Seine estuary, exactly the kind of operation Allied doctrine would prescribe for seizing river crossings and blocking German reinforcements. "Herr Hauptmann, we need armor support," Weber's operations officer insisted, jabbing at the map with a grease pencil. "If the Americans are dropping in battalion strength, infantry alone won't contain them. They'll dig in, establish defensive perimeters. We need tanks to break their positions before they consolidate." Weber nodded grimly. "Contact the 21st Panzer Division. Tell them we have a major airborne incursion northeast of Caen. Request immediate deployment of at least 1 Kampfgruppe." He paused, studying the map. The mathematics of the situation troubled him. So many reported landing zones, spread across 15 kilometers. Either the Americans were executing an incredibly dispersed drop, tactically questionable, or something else was happening. But what choice did he have? Ignore the reports and risk allowing enemy paratroopers to roam freely behind German lines? That was suicide. Better to overreact and be wrong than underreact and lose control of the sector. The telephone rang again. Another report. Parachutes observed near Bolbec. automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. A French farmer claiming Americans had landed in his apple orchard. Weber marked the location and dispatched another platoon. The night was consuming his reserves like fire consuming kindling, and somewhere in the darkness, he knew, real Allied paratroopers were landing on real objectives. But where? Ghosts with guns. While Weber scrambled his forces, Squadron Leader Poole and his 11-man team worked their deadly magic 4 kilometers away. They'd landed in an apple orchard, quickly buried their chutes, and split into 3-man fire teams. Their orders were brutally simple: create maximum noise and confusion for as long as possible, then vanish before dawn. Sergeant Ginger Morrison assembled a portable phonograph, a wind-up device containing recorded battle sounds developed by the BBC's sound effects department. The recording had been meticulously crafted. Rifle volleys, machine gun bursts, grenade explosions, shouted orders in American-accented English. Even the occasional scream of wounded men. It was warfare as theatre, and the Germans were the unwitting audience. Morrison cranked the handle and set it playing. Suddenly, the quiet Norman night filled with the rattle of machine guns, the bark of orders, the screams of wounded men. The recording looped seamlessly, creating the audible signature of a company-sized engagement happening just beyond visual range. 200 meters away, Poole set up a Bren gun position overlooking the main road to Yvetot. He could see vehicle headlights approaching, German reinforcements rushing toward the phantom threat. Beside him, Corporal Matthews fed the ammunition belt, while Private Wilson covered their flanks with a Sten gun. 3 trucks, Matthews whispered, probably 25 men each. Poole waited, letting them close the distance. Timing was everything. Fire too early, and they'd scatter before suffering casualties. Wait too long, and return fire might pin the SAS team in place. He counted seconds, watching the lead truck's headlights grow brighter. Now! The Bren gun roared, spitting. 303 rounds at 500 rounds per minute. The truck's windshield exploded in a shower of glass. The driver slumped forward, dead or dying, and the vehicle veered wildly into a ditch. Soldiers dove from the cargo bed as tracers ripped through canvas and flesh. The second truck slammed its brakes, men tumbling out in panic. "Displacement now!" Poole shouted. The SAS team abandoned the position before German return fire could zero their location. This was guerrilla warfare elevated to psychological art. Fire, move, create noise, disappear. Make them think they were fighting shadows and ghosts, and an army that existed only in their paranoid calculations. They'd covered barely 50 meters when the first German machine gun opened up, raking their former position with MG-42 fire. The distinctive burpee sound of Hitler's buzzsaw tore through the night at 1,200 rounds per minute. Poole grinned despite himself. The Germans were doing exactly what he wanted, committing forces, expending ammunition, creating chaos. Lieutenant Davies' team had set up near a crossroads, planting explosives on a stone bridge. When a German patrol approached, investigating reports of American paratroopers, Davies triggered the charges. The explosion lit the night orange, sending stone fragments and water skyward. The patrol scattered, their radio operator screaming into his handset about American sappers destroying infrastructure, further evidence of a major airborne operation. Throughout the sector, pintail devices continued their mechanical deception. Every 90 seconds a dummy would pop and crack, mimicking rifle fire. The sound was crude, unconvincing at close range, but in darkness, with adrenaline pumping and fear clouding judgment, it was enough. German units would investigate each sound, finding only straw and fabric, but by then, new reports had emerged from different sectors. Some sophisticated models featured pull cords that activated when the parachute snagged on trees or buildings, creating the illusion of paratroopers deploying and immediately engaging. A few even contained small explosive charges that detonated after landing, simulating grenades or demolition work. Poole checked his watch. 01:15. They'd been on the ground for 90 minutes, and the German response was building beautifully. Radio intercepts, monitored by an SOE operative hidden 3 kilometers away, indicated major troop movements. The 701th Infantry Division was fully mobilized. Requests for armor support had been transmitted. The deception was working, but success meant nothing if they didn't survive to report it. Poole gathered his team leaders for a quick conference in a barn basement. "We've got 4 hours until dawn. After that, visibility makes this impossible. We continue harassing operations, hit and run, noise and movement, make them chase ghosts, but nobody plays hero. If it gets hot, you break contact and execute escape protocols. Understood?" Heads nodded in the darkness. These were veteran operators, men who'd survived missions behind enemy lines from Norway to North Africa. They understood the delicate mathematics of guerrilla warfare, inflict maximum disruption while accepting minimal risk. Dead heroes accomplished nothing. "Right then, Davies, take your team north. Set up the second phonograph near that church tower. Morrison, you're with me. We're going to pay a visit to that German supply depot 2 clicks east. Wilson's team provides overwatch and covering fire as needed." They moved like predators through the Norman bocage, the dense network of hedgerows and sunken lanes that defined the landscape. The terrain was claustrophobic, perfect for ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. Every hedge provided cover. Every lane offered an escape route. The supply depot was guarded by perhaps 20 men, most looking more worried about paratroopers than potential sabotage. Poole placed charges on 3 fuel trucks and an ammunition storage shed. When they detonated at a 1:47, the night turned day-bright. Secondary explosions cooked off for 20 minutes as artillery shells and small arms ammunition ignited. The fireball was visible for miles. More chaos, more confusion, more German resources diverted to a threat that barely existed, the Panzer Diversion. At 01:30 hours, Major Hans von Luck received orders that would change the course of D-Day. Commander of the 21st Panzer Division's 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, von Luck had been expecting action, but not this direction. The telephone call came from divisional headquarters, the duty officer's voice tense with urgency. "Herr Major, intelligence reports massive airborne landings northeast of Caen, multiple drop zones. Initial estimates suggest at least battalion strength, possibly brigade. You are to move your Kampfgruppe immediately to eliminate the threat before they can consolidate positions." Von Luck studied his maps under the dim light of a command half-track, his experienced eyes tracking terrain features and road networks. The reported drop zones were nowhere near logical invasion beaches, but Allied airborne doctrine called for securing inland objectives before amphibious forces landed. Perhaps the Americans were attempting to seize the Seine crossings, cutting off German reinforcements from reaching the coast. It was precisely the kind of bold, aggressive move he'd expect from Eisenhower. "Prepare to move out, all units. Combat formation. We hunt paratroopers." Von Luck was a professional soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front where he'd learned that speed and aggression often mattered more than numerical superiority. If Allied paratroopers were landing in strength, every minute of delay allowed them to dig in, establish defensive perimeters, coordinate with local resistance fighters. The textbook response was immediate counterattack. Hit them while they were disorganized, before they could call in air support or link up with advancing ground forces. His Kampfgruppe was a combined arms formation built around armor and mechanized infantry. 15 Panzer IV tanks, 8 Panther tanks, a company of Panzer Grenadiers in half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, combat engineers. Together, they represented devastating striking power, easily capable of annihilating an airborne battalion. The earth trembled as 30-ton Panzertweifels ground into motion, their 75mm guns elevated slightly for road march. The newer Panthers, technological marvels with sloped armor and powerful 75mm KWK-42 guns, fell into formation behind them. Infantry half-tracks followed, carrying Panzer Grenadiers armed with STG-44 assault rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. But they were rolling away from the actual invasion beaches. Every minute they spent chasing dummies was a minute they couldn't spend crushing real Allied landings at Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, and Utah beaches. Every tank diverted northeast was one less tank threatening British commandos at Pegasus Bridge or American paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église. Von Luck's column stretched for 2 kilometers, 40 vehicles churning through narrow Norman lanes designed for farm carts, not modern armor. Progress was frustratingly slow. Tank tracks tore up road surfaces. Half-tracks bottlenecked at intersections. Twice they had to halt while engineers cleared routes blocked by overturned farm equipment. Herr Major, estimated arrival at target zone is 2.15. Von Luck acknowledged the report with growing unease. Something felt wrong about this operation. The reported drop zones were too dispersed, the intelligence too vague. In Russia, he'd learned to trust instinct over orders. Officers who ignored their gut feelings ended up dead or captured. But what choice did he have? Disobey direct orders based on nothing but intuition? He keyed his radio. All units, maintain maximum vigilance. Expect contact with airborne forces armed with anti-tank weapons. Panthers take point. Your armor can withstand bazooka strikes. Panzer Grenadiers prepare for dismounted operations. The web tightens. By 0200 hours, the German response to Operation Titanic had achieved exactly what Allied planners hoped for. Catastrophic misdirection of forces at the worst possible moment. Hauptmann Weber's 711th Infantry Division had committed 60% of available reserves to the phantom airborne threat. 8 companies, nearly 2,200 men, were scattered across 15 square kilometers, investigating dummy drop zones, chasing recordings of battle sounds, and occasionally engaging the 12 actual SAS operators who were wreaking havoc far beyond their numbers. Artillery batteries had fired over 300 rounds at suspected American assembly areas, empty fields that were now cratered wasteland. Reconnaissance units exhausted fuel and manpower sweeping zones where intelligence reported paratrooper activity. Command posts were overwhelmed processing contradictory reports that created a picture of chaos without clarity. And now the 21st Panzer Division, arguably the most dangerous German armored force within striking distance of the landing beaches, was committed to the same wild goose chase. Private Richter, who'd discovered the first dummy hours earlier, was part of a platoon, now advancing through an apple orchard where parachutes hung from branches like ghostly fruit. They'd found 6 more dummies, each one more frustrating than the last. But the gunfire continued, the explosions continued. Something real was happening out here, even if most of the paratroopers were straw. Richter, take your squad and check that farmhouse. Reports of American radio transmissions in this area. Richter led his men forward cautiously. The farmhouse was dark, silent, too silent. He signaled his men to spread out, approaching from multiple angles, standard doctrine for clearing potentially hostile structures. They were 20 meters from the building when it exploded. Not the house itself, a cleverly placed SAS charge in the barn behind it. The blast wave knocked Richter flat. His ears rang. When his vision cleared, the barn was fully engulfed in flames, and his squad mates were shouting about enemy contacts retreating toward the tree line. But by the time they organized pursuit, Poole's team was long gone, already setting up another ambush 2 kilometers away. This was the genius of Operation Titanic. 12 men with limited ammunition and no realistic chance of direct victory could nonetheless control the tactical decisions of thousands. Every German commander faced the same impossible calculation: respond aggressively and risk playing into deception, or ignore reports and risk allowing real threats to develop. Weber made a decision that night that haunted him for the rest of his life. At 02:30, with his forces scattered and exhausted, he received reports of increased naval activity off the Normandy coast. His intelligence officer suggested the airborne operation might be coordinated with amphibious landings. Weber dismissed the theory. Allied doctrine called for airborne forces to land before beach assaults to secure inland objectives. The timeline didn't make sense for simultaneous operations. "Maintain current operations," he ordered. "The airborne threat is real and immediate. Coastal defenses will handle any probe against the beaches. Our priority is eliminating these paratroopers before they link up with resistance fighters or additional drops." It was logical. It was reasonable. It was exactly wrong. Breaking Point von Luck's Kampfgruppe reached the reported landing zone at 02:15. His tankers found parachutes draped over trees, scattered equipment, and clear signs of a drop. But where were the paratroopers? "Dismount. Search formation. All crews maintain readiness." Panzer grenadiers jumped from their half-tracks and fanned out into the darkness. Searchlights mounted on the tanks swept the darkness, creating pools of harsh white light that made everything outside them seem darker. Machine gunners tensed at every shadow, fingers resting on triggers. They found dummies, dozens of them, crude, obvious fakes, now that they could examine them closely in full light. Straw-stuffed torsos with painted faces, fabric limbs that flopped when touched. Some still had pintail devices attached, simple spring-loaded mechanisms that any civilian could have assembled. Von Luck held one of the devices, turning it over in his hands. The engineering was clever but not sophisticated. A spring, a striker, a few firecrackers. Together they created maybe 90 seconds of convincing gunfire sound. Multiply by 500 dummies, space them across a wide area, add some real gunfire from actual soldiers, and you could simulate a major airborne operation. "Herr Major, what are your orders?" The question hung in the night air, weighted with implications. Von Luck understood immediately what had happened. The Allies had deceived them. Brilliantly, elegantly, completely. These dummies were bait, designed to pull German reserves away from somewhere that mattered. The real question was, where? But he couldn't simply abandon the operation without evidence. What if this was a deception within a deception? What if the real paratroopers were still out there, watching his tanks, waiting for him to leave before emerging to cause havoc? The gunfire was real. The explosions were real. His division had lost 6 men to this phantom force already. Continue search operations. Infantry advances in company strength. Tanks provide overwatch. If there are real enemy soldiers operating in this sector, I want them found. The decision cost him 3 more hours. 3 hours of methodically clearing orchards and fields and farmhouses. 3 hours of chasing echoes and investigating reports. 3 hours during which history pivoted on the beaches 50 kilometers away. Meanwhile, Squadron Leader Poole and his team were orchestrating their final act. They'd linked up at a pre-arranged rally point, an abandoned mill near a small river, and were counting ammunition and assessing casualties. Miraculously, all 12 men had survived, though Morrison had taken shrapnel in his left arm from a German grenade, and Wilson was nursing a sprained ankle from a bad landing. "Right, lads," Poole said, checking his watch. "Dawn in 90 minutes. Time to disappear. Morrison, you're with Davies' group. He'll help you reach the safe house in Longville. Wilson, you're with Matthews. Rest of you, standard escape protocol. We rally at Checkpoint Omega in 72 hours or proceed independently to Allied lines. Questions?" "Sir," Wilson asked, "did we do enough?" Poole considered the question seriously. They'd engaged German forces at least a dozen times, destroyed 2 supply depots and a bridge, created noise and chaos across a 15-kilometer front, drawn off what sounded like substantial German forces, multiple companies at minimum, possibly armor. But had it been enough to matter? Would historians look back on this night and see a critical moment, or just an interesting footnote? There was no way to know. The real invasion was happening elsewhere, in darkness and blood on beaches Poole would never see. "We did what we were ordered to do," he finally said. "Whether it was enough isn't our concern. That's for generals to calculate. Our job was surviving while making maximum noise. Mission accomplished on both counts." Dawn's revelation. The first light of June 6, 1944, crept over Normandy at 5:58, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. Squadron Leader Poole watched it from a barn loft where he'd sheltered, his Sten gun across his lap, his body aching from a night of combat and movement. Below him, on the main road, German vehicles were still racing toward the drop zones, trucks full of infantry, motorcycles with sidecars carrying officers and radio operators, even a few armored cars. The Wehrmacht was still committed to the deception, still convinced they were fighting a major airborne operation. Poole allowed himself a slight smile. Then he heard it, distant but unmistakable. Artillery. Not the sporadic fire of the previous night, but sustained barrages, multiple batteries firing in coordinated salvos, and beneath that, even fainter, another sound. Naval gunfire, the deep, thunderous boom of battleship cannons engaging coastal fortifications. The invasion had begun. At 06:30, the truth finally arrived at Weber's command post via coastal observation posts. Massive amphibious fleet off Normandy coast, thousands of vessels, this is the main invasion. Weber stared at the message, feeling sick realization bloom in his gut. The paratroopers, the gunfire, the whole night's chaos, it had been nothing but theatre, expensive, deadly theatre that had accomplished its purpose perfectly. While his division chased scarecrows, real Allied soldiers were storming ashore. He grabbed the telephone, connecting to divisional headquarters. "Get the reserves to the coast, all units, immediate redeployment. This is not a drill." But reserves don't teleport. The companies he'd scattered across the countryside needed time to regroup, to receive new orders, to orient themselves toward different objectives. Equipment had to be loaded. Wounded had to be evacuated. The same roads that had carried them toward the dummy drop zones were now clogged with traffic moving in the opposite direction, and every minute of delay was a minute the Allies used to establish their beachheads more firmly. Von Luck received similar orders at 06:45. His immediate response was to begin repositioning his Kampfgruppe toward the coast. But the logistics were nightmarish. His column was spread across 5 kilometers, tangled in narrow lanes. Some units were still engaged in clearing operations. Artillery pieces had to be limbered up. Tank crews needed time to refuel after hours of maneuvering. "Maximum speed," he ordered into his radio. "Forget march formation. Independent movement. All units proceed directly to Sword Beach." But as his Panthers and Panzer Rifles ground back toward the main roads, he knew they were already too late. The invasion would be hours old by the time he arrived. Whatever advantage the Germans might have had from catching the Allies at their most vulnerable during the initial landing had evaporated. Coastal defense units reported British infantry swarming ashore at Sword Beach, Canadian forces landing at Juneau, the Americans hitting Gold, Omaha, and Utah, and most critically, British 6th Airborne Division, real paratroopers, not dummies, had successfully seized Pegasus Bridge and other vital objectives. The deception had worked. The aftermath Operation Titanic cost the British 12 men and 500 straw dummies. The men all survived the operation itself, though 2, Corporal Harrison and Private Welch, were captured during extraction 3 days later and executed by SS troops in violation of the Geneva Convention. They died knowing their mission had succeeded beyond all strategic expectations. German after-action reports would later show the full scope of the deception's success. The 701th Infantry Division committed 60% of its available reserves, 1,200 combat-ready soldiers, to countering a threat that existed primarily in imagination. These troops were not available to reinforce coastal defenses during the critical first hours of D-Day. The 21st Panzer Division lost 5 critical hours and burned substantial fuel chasing phantoms. When they finally engaged Allied forces at Sword Beach around noon on June 6th, they were operating at reduced combat effectiveness. Tanks were low on fuel, crews were exhausted, command coordination was disrupted. Instead of hitting the British 3rd Infantry Division during their vulnerable landing phase, von Luck's panzers engaged them after they'd established firm positions inland. Military historians estimate Operation Titanic diverted approximately 2,500 German soldiers during D-Day's opening hours. In the grand calculus of an invasion involving 156,000 Allied troops, that might seem insignificant. But battles are won in marginal gains. Every German soldier chasing dummies was one not reinforcing the beaches. Every tank stuck in traffic 15 miles from the action was one not firing on landing craft. The real genius of Operation Titanic wasn't the dummies themselves. It was exploiting German doctrine and psychology. Wehrmacht commanders were trained to respond aggressively to airborne threats. Their standing orders mandated immediate counterattack against paratrooper incursions. The Allies simply weaponized that doctrine, turning German efficiency against itself. Squadron Leader Poole received the Distinguished Service Order for his actions that night. Years later, in his memoirs, he wrote, "We didn't defeat the German army with straw men. We defeated them with their own assumptions. They believed airborne troops required immediate response, so we gave them airborne troops, or the appearance of them. They believed in decisive action, so we forced them to act decisively against nothing. War is as much about perception as reality. Sometimes the greatest victories are won by making the enemy defeat themselves." The 12 SAS operators scattered into the French countryside after dawn, following escape routes planned weeks earlier. Some linked up with resistance networks. Others hid in barns and cellars, protected by French civilians who risked torture and death to shelter them. 3 weeks later, all surviving members had reached Allied lines, carrying with them German documents, intelligence, and first-hand accounts of Wehrmacht response patterns. Major von Luck survived the war and later wrote extensively about June 6, 1944. In his account, he describes the bitter realization of discovering the dummies. "We had been brilliantly deceived, not by superior forces or better equipment, but by imagination and audacity. 12 men with firecrackers had delayed an entire Panzer Division. It was humiliating. It was also masterful. I learned that day that modern warfare is as much psychological as physical. The side that controls perception controls the battlefield." Hauptmann Weber was relieved of command 3 weeks after D-Day. His superiors blamed him for the misallocation of resources, though the decision to respond aggressively to the dummy drops was entirely consistent with Wehrmacht doctrine. He spent the rest of the war in administrative positions far from frontline command. In later years, he became a vocal advocate for questioning standing orders, arguing that rigid doctrine creates exploitable vulnerabilities. The dummy paratroopers themselves became artifacts of deception history. Several were recovered after the war and preserved in military museums. They're remarkably crude. Fabric sacks with painted faces, stuffed with straw and sand, equipped with simple spring-loaded noisemakers. They look like something children might assemble for a school play. Yet these theatrical props altered the course of the largest military operation in history. The legacy Operation Titanic has become a case study in military deception, taught at staff colleges from Sandhurst to West Point. It demonstrates several principles that remain relevant in modern warfare. The first lesson is psychological. Military forces often respond predictably to perceived threats. Doctrine creates patterns, and patterns create vulnerabilities. An enemy who always responds one way to a particular threat can be manipulated by creating that threat, real or imagined. The second lesson is about resource allocation. In warfare, being in the wrong place at the right time is often worse than being absent entirely. The 21st Panzer Division was combat-ready and eager to fight on D-Day, but they fought phantoms instead of invaders, wasting their effectiveness on empty fields. The third lesson is about asymmetry. 12 men cannot defeat a division in direct combat. But 12 men with the right tools, training, and mission can influence how a division allocates its resources. Sometimes force multiplication comes not from adding more forces, but from subtracting enemy forces through misdirection. Modern militaries have learned these lessons well. Operation Titanic has spiritual descendants in every subsequent conflict involving deception operations. During the Gulf War, coalition forces used decoy armor and false radio traffic to make Iraqi defenders believe the main attack would come from Kuwait when the real assault swept through the desert from the west. In Afghanistan, special forces teams used similar psychological warfare tactics, creating the illusion of larger forces through noise, movement, and skillful manipulation of enemy assumptions. The technology has evolved. Modern dummies don't need spring-loaded firecrackers. They have electronic warfare systems that can mimic radar signatures, heat signatures, and communication patterns. But the underlying psychology remains unchanged. Humans make decisions based on available information. If you control what information they receive, you control their decisions. On the hedgerows and fields of Normandy, a monument now stands near one of Operation Titanic's drop zones. It's a simple stone marker with a plaque describing the operation. Local historians estimate perhaps 200 of the original 500 dummies landed in this region. Most were burned or destroyed by Germans who eventually realized the deception. A few survived, collected by French civilians as bizarre souvenirs of liberation. Echoes through time. The story of Operation Titanic resonates because it appeals to something fundamental in human nature. The idea that cleverness can triumph over strength, that imagination can defeat force, that David can fell Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone, or in this case, with straw and firecrackers. But history requires honesty. Operation Titanic succeeded not in isolation, but as part of a comprehensive deception architecture. The Allies didn't rely on dummy paratroopers alone. They employed an entire orchestra of deceptions, false radio traffic suggesting armies that didn't exist, double agents feeding misinformation to German intelligence, fake equipment positioned to be photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. Operation Fortitude, the larger deception campaign, convinced Hitler that the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles from the actual Normandy beaches. The Germans kept an entire army group in reserve there for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that never came. Operation Titanic was one instrument in that symphony of lies. The 12 SAS operators understood they were part of something larger than themselves. Their mission wasn't to win battles, it was to buy time, create confusion, and contribute to accumulated advantages that would eventually cascade into victory. Military history remembers the big moments, the beach landings, the tank battles, the aerial duels. But wars are won in aggregate, through thousands of small actions that individually seem insignificant but collectively become decisive. Years after the war, survivors of Operation Titanic held reunions. They'd gather, these aging men who'd shared one extraordinary night, and remember. They'd laugh about the absurdity of it, grown soldiers fighting with toys and recordings. They'd mourn the two who'd been captured and executed, and they'd wonder, as soldiers always wonder, what their actions actually meant in the vast machinery of war. What is known? On June 6, 1944, 500 straw men accomplished what battalions of real soldiers might have struggled to achieve. They became the most effective decoys in military history, proving that in war, the enemy's assumptions can be as lethal to them as any bullet, if you're clever enough to exploit those assumptions. Squadron Leader Poole lived until 1987. He never forgot the absurdity and brilliance of that night, saving lives with lies, defeating an army with illusions, winning battles by making the enemy fight shadows. In his final interview, given to a British military historian, he was asked what he learned from Operation Titanic. "That war is theatre," he replied. "The best generals are the best storytellers. They make the enemy believe a narrative that serves their purposes. We told the Germans a story about massive airborne landings. They believed it because it fit their expectations, their doctrine, their fears. And that belief, that story they told themselves, cost them the war. Sometimes the greatest weapons aren't forged from steel. Sometimes they're just straw.